it shouldn't take no rocket science to understand that. But we're not presenting that to the people, none of us. Even with you helping me many years ago, owning a radio station. We need those kinds of things where you can reach people. We have no mechanism to give people the kind of information. In my community, the black community, we give them two things. Either rap, rhythm and blues, or gospel. No news, no public affairs, no nothing. But those things. And that's how it's come about Citadel.
I wanted to go back to something you had said, Mr. Saunders, or something you touched upon in your comments as you're talking about history. In a sense, you've got a good captive audience here of engaged historians who are concerned with human rights and justice. And I'm wondering if you, Mr. Saunders, or Ms. Moultrie, Ken, if you have any thoughts on how you think historians can be engaged in the kinds of ongoing struggles that you've been a part of. If you could say a little bit about history, the role of academics. I don't know if that sparks any thoughts, but you're in a position here to make demands on this group. I'd encourage you to do so.
Well, I think that history has to begin to be used for the betterment of people, and not just for historians. And that's what I've run into most of my life. It's about the people that are doing the writing or doing the research. It has to be something coming out of it, going back, that's going to enhance people in the future. And I'm on a board right now on commission, the Gullah Commission. And we got, I think, 15 PhDs and 2-3 lawyers and a couple other economists, stuff like that. And we're in a mess. There's very brilliant people, but they're concerned about their intellectual combativeness with each other. Not about what we can get out of this. When I left St. Augustine the other day, driving home, that I was just going to resign, and then I decided I better not do that from this group. But we're going to have to begin to hold historians also accountable, to the use of the material that comes out of these communities. And that some of the stuff has to go back to use for the future generation. And that's not happening at all. Very rarely that you find a historian that's really been on the ground and did some stuff and willing to put their stuff on the line. But these people that I'm talking about, good people, but they're just intellectually lost.
Well, I think documentation, I now believe documentation is crucial because when I was at the college going to history class, there was only one thing I wanted to get out of history, and that was a D, so I could move on to the next but now, really, I'm serious. I've learned so much, not only here at the conference, but since I've gotten into the work world, how valuable, how important history is, because especially when you're documenting struggles and so forth, because there are lessons learned. And if you do not come out the other side of the struggle better than you make going in, then you struggle in vain, as far as I'm concerned. So each time I go through a struggle, I learn something, and then if I've learned something, then maybe someone else could learn from it if it's documented properly, so that they won't have to go through, or they'll know how to go through a struggle of that magnitude. So, that's very important.
And I also believe that through these documentation, you should make it available to the younger people. Use the type of language that they could understand. Because a lot of times things are documented. You try to read it as if you're not on the same level as the person who wrote it. I mean, it's no good. So you have to, put it on more than one level, so that people, would be able, the younger people would be able to read it. Because number one, if they pick it up in the language, it's not what they see. They're not even gonna try to read it. So you need to make it available to all, not just a certain group of people.
Kerry, I think, I just want to, you asked my question, I even had it written down. So, I think that, another thing about this is that it's also educating the general public about labor and kind of working class struggles, because, you know, when you go to organize a plant, you've got a bunch of workers who've been indoctrinated from middle school, you know, through, or, you know, throughout the rest of their education and on TV and by the government about all the kind of negatives of unions or the negatives of struggle. Then, you know, you're fighting a very difficult battle. And so I think one of the things that you know, that historians have to do is a better job of, and I think, you know, whether it's young people, you know, in schools or community groups or whatever, finding ways of combating that kind of the traditional narratives here. And I mean, I think there's a lot of that going on around the country, but it's still, I think there's more of it that has to happen.
You know, one of the things, just dealing with that, with the sanitation worker that we're working with right now, we need help for these workers to understand that the city of Charleston, Mayor Raleigh and them, are setting up things that they're gonna fight among themselves. The supervisors are doing something for this one, and then secretly telling this other one something, and they're confused and also mad at each other. And they're the only one that's hurting. We need the kind of documentation that you can go in with them saying that, you know, here's what's gonna happen when we start this organization.
Right.
Here's what these people are gonna do to you, and here's what you're gonna have to be about to us. And we've got that information. I'm sorry, Jim.
But I also, but it still goes back to what I was saying earlier. You don't wait until you wanna have an organizing drive
Right.
to start trying to educate. It's too late then. That has to be an ongoing process. And like I said, there is enough money in the union system to be doing that on a regular basis. It's just not being allocated properly. We are weighing too heavily on the government, on politicians, on candidates to do our bidding. And they're not gonna do it. Most of them, when they get in office, they are now, the day they are sworn in is the day they start working on a re-election campaign. And so, no one's gonna do this work for us. And with the check off that I see, the numbers that I see going into these accounts on an annual basis, I can't even imagine having just a portion of that and putting on full-time people here that's coming up with educational programs, and because it's gonna take a cultural change. And so you're gonna have to invest in that. And we have the money, that's the thing. And even in our pension funds, there's supposedly enough money in the union's pension fund collectively to pay off the national debt. Unionize half-heartedly funds to pay off the national debt. And we, as organized labor, cannot find a way to leverage all of that to change the culture in this country.
Mr. Campbell.
Yeah, thank you. I think this panel is really the nucleus, the central idea of this conference, and may have been, I saw Brian here.
He just stepped out a second.
Yeah, may very well could have been the centerpiece of the conference, because at root, what you're talking about is labor on a global basis, going back in time. Bill's first early lamenting of the people in history have nothing to do with the writing of it. And I put in here, Breck, a worker reads history. If that's the centerpiece, I was in a section this morning on building curriculum. Now, I didn't say anything as an old curriculum builder that was involved in that ideological struggle in New York City schools, where we were getting African American content fused into the regular social studies curriculum. Now, they've done a lot of good work around that curriculum that's going on up in Greenville. But still, it doesn't rise to the central idea that was stated by Kenny Riley. There can be no globalization without trade. There can be no trade without production. That's the central ideological idea of this process. You're talking about the movement of African workers around the world in the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century to build something that we don't mention, capitalism. We were the market. African people, not slaves. African people taken out of West Africa with a language, a history, a culture, and the advanced building of communities that were on par with where feudalism was in Europe at that time. Those were the disruptions. Now this was the second disruption in that part of West Africa. The first was the jihadist movement that had come down out of North Africa, very similar to what's going on in the jihadist movement today. Not as violently terroristic, but in its own way for that period of time, terroristic. Now, coming into this area with these people, the Europeans with land, central for production that needs labor, that then produces the products for trade. I'm struck by the fact that in Charleston, Africans being offloaded on the docks of Charleston by other African people with whom they could not communicate. But yet seeing in their lineages, in their features, recognition of people who were in their families at Sullivan's Island or in the port of Charleston. But we're talking about the movement of African people, not slaves. If you take the slave narrative, you're taking a narrative that psychologically and ideologically say, you have surrendered to these oppressive forces. You will not get resistance from a slave narrative. If you take a narrative that say these were African people, they didn't come here culturally empty-handed. They brought brains and minds and long cultural experiences in buildings of civilization, in manufacturing, and in a trans-Saharan trade through barter. It was very civilized, very trustworthy, and it was a continental-wide trade in that West African, North African, going as far as East Africa, of course. But these are the things that I would like to suggest to the thinking in terms of the ideological content, the philosophical content, the economic content, the historical content, and the human evolutionary content. We're not talking about the movement of slaves. We're talking about a trade in human beings on a global scale, and it was the first globalization. This globalization today is the second globalization of capitalism that Kerry is facing, and the workers in the ILA. And that old man sitting in the British Museum in the middle of the 19th century, who we don't want to talk about, making notes by himself in the British Museum, 1840s.
I think we
He
probably
got it right.
have time for a couple more questions.
You got what I'm saying, Kerry?
Did anyone care to respond? Or?
I understand what you're saying. I think that's nothing to respond to. We need to work on that. That's what he was saying. We need to work on that. Someone like that.
George first.
George Hopkins, College Charlotte. I'd like to build on some of the comments about the linkages between labor and community groups and academic groups, and sort of Bob was talking about it and Jim as well. I think it's sort of a reciprocal, dialectical kind of thing we have to have here. I know a lot of people at this conference and in this audience have worked with labor organizations.
Yeah, that's it. He said you said dialectical.
I know it. That was on purpose. I've worked with labor organizations and campaigns and all that. I think it's gotta be even more overt than that.